So quickly, the tipping points I referred to, we were going to have a picture of the Herman Miller Action Office up there, around 50 years ago that was developed. Now, what sort of percentage of companies exist now that were in the top 500 companies, Fortune 500 companies in America 50 years ago? The answer is only 12% of them actually exist now, 50 years later. So understanding strategy and business strategy is terribly important for our clients. The other tipping point I think that I've seen just earlier this year, one of our clients actually, 10,000 square metres, has gone to the market and says, we don't want to sign a lease for all of that space. We'll happily sign for half of that, but we want the market to come back with flexibility around our space because we don't know how much we need. And that's the first time I think I've seen that anywhere in the world. The other tipping point is the way that co-working spaces are now being massively taken up by corporations. I don't know if you saw a few weeks ago, but Sprint, which is one of the big mobile phone telcos in America, has actually given the job to create its new headquarters to WeWork. Now, that should send a shiver down every designer's spine that, it's WeWork that their model is being rolled out. And it's now the largest lessor of space in markets such as the UK. And it's a very simplistic model, but it is totally flexible. Now, I think you start to look at all those things, we're clearly entering a different era of the office space of the building. So I'd like to start with a question to everyone, but I'll start with Karen because I think to actually have a client here is a great opportunity, and we'll do questions later so you can grill her a bit further. But Karen, perhaps you could talk a bit about some of your recent projects with Macquarie, and how did you incorporate the strategy of the business into your real estate thinking and planning and workplace planning?
Okay, I'll talk about Asia because during the GFC, Macquarie was hit quite heavily in the Asian area, and a lot of our offices were on leases that were expiring over the last couple of years. So we were looking at new properties, where we were going to go, and looking at the future strategies for the businesses over there because the Asian market was obviously changing. So some of the businesses thought that they'd grow quite rapidly, others sort of didn't have a clear idea. So we had to really align with those businesses and their strategy on a consistent basis throughout our site acquisition process and our design process because things were changing very, very quickly. So in Beijing, for example, we acquired a site that was quite appropriate for our needs at the time and gave us the opportunity to expand the floor plate if we needed to because they didn't have a tenant nearby. So, we designed the office and we made sure we specifically designed positions of comms rooms and other utilities that were quite fixed within the office so that they weren't impacting the design if we grew or contracted. So that was something we found very important because we did contract quite a bit during the GFC in some of our Asian locations and Sydney locations. So being able to offload that space is very important, and to work with the business continually on the direction of where their business, how their business is tracking and what they foresee in the future. Because there are internal cultural influences that have a great impact on the strategy, but we're finding more and more that the external influences are quite heavy now. So, it's that constant communication with the businesses and tapping into the strategy because it changes quite regularly. So, yeah.
And Richard, your buildings, do you get to be at that front line with the client, or are you working more with the developer and anticipating the future changes? What are the sorts of things that you're putting into your new buildings?
Well, I think, such a complexity of things that surround creating an environment for people to work in and representing and facilitating the kind of vision objectives of an institution, an organisation, whatever it might be. It's very, very complex. And if you zoom out and actually think about the building, it's got to sit in the city. You're dealing with huge investment equations, approval issues, public domain, environmental impacts. You know, it's a very big equation that you're dealing with before you get into actually what is the details of what goes into the space. And I think that when we're in these periods, as you're alluding to, James, of, that are quite dynamic, there's a lot of change, there's a lot of uncertainty at every level, even from an investment point of view. There can be these uncertainties. Then people always ask these questions, well, how is this going to last? You know, we don't know what's going to happen. How are we going to make sure all the cabling's in place? Well, how's it going to deal with the way in which we're going to work in future? How many people per square metres? How many bathrooms? So all of these sorts of parameters that people can have anxiety about. And the reality is these questions are very, very difficult to answer. You know, we can think about the direction of change and we can think that's the way it's going to go. Right? We can see it plotting out, that's the way it's going to go. Well, historically, that never happens for very long. You know, change doesn't do that. It goes through paradigm shifts. You know, then it goes flat, then it goes flat again. So change is a very complex and difficult thing. It's hard to know whether you're at the edge of a threshold of change or whether you're actually on the other side of it. So I think for designers and for organisations themselves, it can breed a lot of anxiety, a lot of doubt, and I get a lot of questions about that. Yep. How is this building going to do this? How are we going to make sure this building lasts? We've got to make it totally flexible. We've got to have a raised floor. We've got to have all of this stuff in here. Yep. All the metrics you can put around flexibility, they themselves, I think, are a big problem. Actually, you know, I think you can't measure flexibility in that way. I think it's a kind of error, actually, because what you need to do is you need to look at, well, what has sustained actually? You know, like change just doesn't go forward; it goes backwards. Right? You can say, well, it's going to be so different tomorrow. It's so different than it was last week. True, but you know, it was different a year ago, 500 years ago. It was different, but you know, on another level, it was exactly the same. We were trading goods, we were inventing ideas, we were writing music, whatever we were doing.
We were still human.
We were still here. It was the same, you know, and people were doing pretty good.
Yep.
So you've got to look at things that sustain, things that last. And if you ask this question, how do we make a building that is going to be as valued and as relevant 100 years from now, 150 years from now, then, you know, you need to look back as much as you look forward. And it's interesting that a lot of high technology companies, a lot of very progressive organisations like to occupy old buildings. We're in an old building here, you know, it's an industrial building, never foresaw this use. All this infrastructure that's gone in here that makes this a kind of really cool space for this was never anticipated by the designers. But what was created was something of a certain overwhelming quality and grandeur and sense of significance and connection to its place. And so we want to adapt it, we want to reuse it. It will last forever. This will be here forever. Maybe not this room, maybe not that furniture, but this will be here. So I think when you're at these tricky thresholds where there's a lot of nervousness and anxiety, it's really important to look forward, but it's also really important to look as what's happening, because we're part of a continuum. And some of those things, the human things, are not actually going to change.
Yep. Yeah, well, not quickly anyway.
No. You're not going to get sick of natural light. You're not going to get sick of fresh air. You're not going to get sick of talking to each other.
We're not going to evolve out of
You're not going to get
limbs.
sick of good materials, and you know, and being able to move around, sense of freedom. You know, that is not going to change. Yeah.
In terms of that human point, I think that's really important, because often we're focusing a lot on strategy in terms of what organisations need and what are their drivers, but ultimately what makes organisations is the people. And you know, if you know, we're responding to human needs, ultimately the organisation is going to be better functioning. People will be more productive if they are happier and healthier. So I think that really at the core of a lot of design, and sometimes we miss that, is the human element. You know, and good buildings are about having beautiful natural light and things that you talked about. So I think that, yeah, sometimes yes, it's great to have, you know, look at the organisational strategy, but really what's important to the individual needs, because that will keep it all going.
Richard, you touched on something that I think potentially is going to be very important going forward, and I think, Karen, this is an area of your expertise as well. And specifically these sorts of models, which is why I asked Kirsten to bring these old photos along. a lot of the rules we think are fixed about real estate were developed around this time. You know, the first sealed office building in Australia was only late 50s. And yet, I think the world has changed very quickly since that, and just over the last 10 years. So, for example, Macquarie bought their own building. The market couldn't provide easily the type of product that they wanted. The 10-year leases are starting to change, and people can't commit to that sort of thing. It's harder and harder for organisations or developers to get that big pre-commitment for that length of time. Do you think it's fundamentally, you know, that dynamic around the lease, the real estate, that the way the property industry has provided space is going to change the way we do things?
There is certain you get these kind of thresholds of how we structure our technology that enable rapid change. You can think of the invention of the elevator, for example. Suddenly we could move vertically, you know, really fast and really conveniently. And then on top of that, there was the escalator, and then there's been other changes. But the elevator was actually a huge paradigm shift. We could build differently, and it really enabled the tall building, not steel construction, but that was part of it. But really, it was the elevator. Then you can look at wireless technology, basically, right? So suddenly we could, you know, unplug ourselves. So radical change, you know, enabled radical change, which have very significant architectural, spatial, organisational structures. So they're very real paradigm shifts that it often takes us as designers, and I think all of the organisations we work for, some time to come to terms with this. Suddenly, you know, everything's changed, and we've got this freedom, so everyone sort of runs around like a headless chicken before they understand.
And you're left at the drafting board having to actually do something.
So, you know, it takes a while to come to terms with these. In terms of property and how property is owned, leased, or regulated, and those changes, they can also be very radical, and we see that they actually shape cities, particularly in relation to height limits, property development equations, overshadowing, all of these things, including
Types
our
of
own
use.
city. Public ownership versus private ownership, and all. So we can see how that can have physical manifestations. When it comes down to lease terms and that side of things, I don't think that's as significant myself. You know, and I think you can look at a more flexible WeWork model, or you can look at a more traditional 7+7 or 10+10 lease term, and of course the second one is going to suit the market at a certain level. But you know, one thing you know about the market, it is super adaptable. You know, capitalism is so reflexive and adaptable in a microsecond, right? So suddenly, you know, that's the new model, no problem, right? So I don't think that's going to have that level of threshold.
Karen, we were talking earlier about the way that you need, when you're in a large organisation, designers and others to sort of constantly be, you know, engaging with you to share ideas, etc. Can you explain how that would ideally work?
I think, you know, we, in my experience, we have relied on a lot of our consultants, designers and engineers, and people with experience and who have case studies that, you know, they can present to us to show us, you know, some of the most some of the best practices that we can incorporate into our design. So we really engage consultants to be to give us some direction, because we don't always know what's best in the workspace and where we want to go. And, you know, involving people, whether, you know, with experience, and most people have international experience that we've found, or most companies, and they've done something that has really resonated with them, and they think it will work for our company. You know, we really embrace those ideas, and I think, you know, also consultants challenging our strategies and our, you know, the way that we feel our people would be best positioned, or the workspace that they'd work best in. We actually enjoyed being challenged quite a lot, because some of the best ideas came out of those challenges.
Yeah. And Kirsten, how do you, with the providing the settings to fill up the Richards buildings, how do you sort of engage with your clients, designers, to sort of really make sure the strategy of what they're doing is as good as it can be?
I think it's a few things, particularly, firstly, listening, really understanding what's required. We hear the word flexibility, and Karen and I were talking about this early, the space needs to, all the settings need to be completely flexible. Everyone seems to want everything on wheels these days, and, that seems to be the latest thing. So I think it's what does actually flexibility mean? Does that mean having things on wheels that you can move around, 3 times a day? Or does it mean that your 2-year lease, you can pack up and take everything with you and reconfigure it? So I think in terms of talking to end clients and also designers, really understanding what the brief is. So just like you take a brief from a client, it's a similar thing with the expertise of knowing, different solutions and how they can meet the need. What is actually the need at the core of it?
Do you think that as leases change, Karen talked about the flexibility of dynamics of businesses that don't know how big or small they're going to be. Do you think it will be that people won't actually buy the furniture, that you'll end up keeping it all and just lending it to them for a period of time?
Definitely, and look, that's becoming more of a conversation, but at the moment, from a financial point of view, it doesn't actually work as a model, leasing, because the value of furniture, particularly, some furniture doesn't, at the end of the lease, it has no value.
Right.
So, but
not your furniture.
Exactly.
Yours
it's good for us because
that's
the good thing. That at least because all the furniture is so durable and has such long warranties, it does have value at the end of a lease. So yeah, that it only works for a particular type of product, and also things that can be reused and reconfigured. So if you are leasing it and then you're moving to the next premises, you might choose to refurb or add on and reconfigure it, or start afresh.
Yeah, it does seem as we speed everything up with the wireless devices and whatever, that what we actually own in corporates is changing. Like Qantas don't own the engines. They lease the planes. They pretty much are a brand and a booking website, and the people, the Uber driver I had here pays $220 a week for his car to lease it month by month and claims it all as an expense. It's, cars will just sit on the street and you jump in one and go. Is that the sort of thing that the organisations are looking at, Karen, to how to sort of take things off the balance sheet and have that total flexibility?
Yeah, I think they'd like it. And, even the WeWork model coming in has corporates thinking, is this really, perhaps, in smaller, we were talking about it, we didn't really look into it, but, for our smaller locations, it seems silly that we put 30 people in an office and then, we might shrink 1 year, we might expand 2 years later, and we're paying for all this real estate that isn't flexible for us. So, models like WeWork are fine, but I definitely do think that there's possibly potential, particularly in small regional offices like that, where the expansion and contraction is pretty much year on year, it changes, so yeah.
Yep. And for the audience, the young designers here sort of starting out in this field that we work in, how would you get up to speed? What sort of work would you do to be good enough to go to a Macquarie and say, I've got some ideas about how you could be, better suiting your business? How would you go about that?
Macquarie is a wonderful organisation in that it loves innovation, it likes fresh ideas. I don't think we were often approached by people, young people coming to us with ideas in that regard, but, I think it would be welcomed. We, quite mature consultants that came to us with ideas, we'd actually bring them in, listen to them, and quite often engage them. So, yeah, that's Macquarie as an organisation, and that's part of their culture and what they believe in. But I think there's definitely an interest in what young people have to bring, or young designers have to bring to the table.
Yep. And Richard, how do you bring that sort of sense of understanding what's going on in the bigger world, in particular sort of workplace and strategy? How do you bring that into the studio so that it's, you're getting the most out of your people and they're thinking in the right way?
I think, our organisation, our design organisation, what drives it and what sustains it ultimately is its culture. Is the values that sit behind it, and I think when you just come to deal with a client, let's say an organisation that is evolving, growing, or contracting, or has some needs, you look at a few traditionally, we as designers look at a few measures of that. And you know, when you think about how do you structure it, well, there's the technology. Well, clearly pivotal. Pivotal, that's going to be an enabler or an obstruction or a limitation.
So we don't have to worry about that because our kids grow up with an iPad in their face. So they...
That's right. Yes, but you know, the thing is, freedom's a sort of a weird thing, right? Because you just actually it's another form of enslavement that you've just stepped into.
Yeah.
And that's what we discovered. We discovered that we're free. We thought we were free. We got these things. How awesome is that, right?
Yeah.
And now we have a huge problem.
Yeah.
You have a huge problem, you know, and if you have children, you know, your engagement is challenged by this thing. Throw them an iPad, you don't have to worry about it, you know, and then they're gone. So you know, it's hard to know what we think is an enabler, perhaps isn't, and it's hard to make judgments about technology and our relationship to it. Another aspect to this is engagement, which of course is becoming a bigger and bigger part of what we do and get involved in. A lot of that is about change management, getting people on board, the management of the process. Obviously, there's a lot of good data that's gathered, but nevertheless, a lot of it is that. Then another issue is just the metrics, the data. Okay, it's got to be this big, that big, but beyond that, one of the things we're trying to come to terms with generally, I think, is big data and the amount of data that we can get. Well, a building we've recently finished, there's been a lot of data tracking of a whole lot of employees in this organisation through their phones. It's kind of awesome. Everyone's really excited. We're gathering all of this data. People are doing. These people are talking to those. You know, it tells you where someone is. It's amazing, right? So all this data's got collected, and it's kind of what do we do with this data?
Yeah.
So, for example, one thing that has been established is the use of showers and the amount of hot water. Right?
What, they track them in there as well?
No, but you can track. Well, so it's really interesting. This is really interesting, right? So, quite a big organisation. By gender, you can track hot water shower duration use, right? And it will tell you.
What, women have longer showers
No.
or shorter showers?
No, men.
Men have longer
Men.
showers.
No, so this is measurable.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
important.
so men are in the shower for a lot longer and use a lot more hot water per capita, right? So you sort of think, awesome.
Yeah, that's really
What on earth
useful
does
for
that
my
mean?
corporate
Really
strategy.
useful. You think, okay, so look, that means we should have more showers in the male. So male and less than. So you've got to think, well, wait a minute, what are we doing here, right? First of all, should we be collecting that data? No, really seriously, should we? Bit binary anyway, isn't it? And why have we got male and female anyway? And what actually use is that data, and is it actually even data that should see the light of day? I mean, we don't measure what's the proportion of hot water used by short people.
Yeah.
Do we? Why wouldn't we do that? Because
Could you
it's
do that?
unethical.
It sounds like you could.
It's unethical. You wouldn't do it. Why have we got male and female anyway? Totally binary, completely inappropriate, right? So you got data which, and this is a big issue for us. You know, we don't know what to do with it. We don't really know how to. It's dangerous to draw conclusions from it. It's like all sort of statistical data. It's framed. Right? It's a big problem. Everything's framed, and so you think it holds the truth, but actually it doesn't at all.
I think you're onto something. I think one of the things that bothers me about strategy in workplace is that you've got the management consultants doing all their thing, but there's never any dialogue with the architects. It's almost like left brain, right brain or something. They never actually. So there's all this data that you can collect about buildings, and there's all the data but somehow we need a mechanism for bringing all this stuff together.
I think it's an issue. People say, well, 27% of people, blah, 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 so we should do that. And you can think, oh, yeah, that's data, we should do that. But the way we're collecting data at the moment, metadata, is so primitive, right? It's so unstructured. And we've just fallen into it, like all of this stuff.
Yeah.
We haven't thought, actually, you know what, you shouldn't collect that data. That data should not be collected. Things should not be framed that way. And that's why what I come back to is the most important thing, I think, in these metrics of information and structuring of our workplace environments or institutions is actually values.
Oh.
Is values. Is what's different, you know, like apart from universal and flexible. That's actually, as a designer, that's what I look for. Not what is all of that changeability suits everybody, but what are the values behind, what's driving this organisation what are the values, and how do we measure everything we're doing, and in that frame,
Yep.
but also realise it, represent it in the architecture, in the space, in the design.
No, I think that's right. And I think one of the interesting areas that's emerged over the last 5 years or so is around wellness, and it's now become a key part of the culture, and certainly the recruitment and attract and retain strategy is really promoting it, and there's a lot of data and evidence. I always felt jealous because you can easily prove that every dollar you spend on wellness you get $3 back, but you could never prove that in terms of productivity. But where do you think we're heading with wellness in the workplace?
Look, I think it's a conversation that people have been having for a long time. It's been around for 3 or 5 years, in terms of actually what does it mean, moving forward, and in terms of design of workplace, what does it mean? I think we're still yet to really know that. Your comment about I think it's actually been used a lot more for attraction and retention strategy more than looking after the actual health of individuals.
Right.
With interviewing.
So it's kind of a follow me kind of thing, because Macquarie have got chickens on the roof, so then everyone needs...
Exactly. And it's like when you come down to the micro level of the height adjustable desk, it's like, oh, well, they're doing it next door, so therefore we should do it.
Yep.
And often what I've found from interviewing people in my research is that it's often based on bite-sized bits of information. So what I found surprising when I actually started to review the research in detail was that behind these bite-sized headlines that we keep seeing, that strategy is built on, that some of the evidence is actually quite weak from an academic viewpoint. It might be looking at 5 people for 5 days.
Yes.
And we're building strategies on that.
And it's getting front page headlines and causing all this noise.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there is data being collected, and I totally agree with you. Some of it's not quite, is it useful? The bits that are useful, we are collecting at an academic level and a research level. Some of that's being digested and researched and analysed, but we're yet to create that and then actually implement it into workplace. So I still think there's a big gap between the research and the real evidence, and designers being aware of what that is and implementing it in their projects, or even end users and clients and organisations being aware of the real research and implementing it.
Yeah, good. Karen, what do you think is going to be the big strategic issue for organisations, say in 10 years' time? What are the challenges that are going to be front and centre of a global head of real estate for organisations?
Look, I think it always comes back to staff attraction and retention. I think, that's how you get productivity, really, isn't it? Unless robotics totally take over every company, but I don't think that'll happen in 10 years. So I think, that's one of the core, and I really think, and knowing from some of the projects that I've worked on in the last 4 or 5 years, is not only talking to the key stakeholders and the champions, but getting down to the employee level and talking to them. I think there's and HR divisions are really running a lot of their strategies by talking to the individuals and finding out what's driving the employment and the workforce. And there's more value in talking to everyone, as opposed to just talking to the senior management and what do you want your office to look like.
That has been a big change, hasn't it? Like, I think the tech industry, the Googles and the like, have taken a jump. They didn't spend as much money on their workplace. They made it funkier, and they put the food and they spent their money on other things as part of the kit. That's
exactly what we were finding at Macquarie as well. The spaces that people liked weren't necessarily the spaces that we spent a lot of money on. They were spaces that people felt comfortable in, and they felt were real and not too corporate looking. And we're finding a real shift away from the corporate looking office to more of a relaxed sort of environment. We set up a pilot space. It was a cafeteria, and it was only temporary, and it was all on stage set design, props and things. And the staff we ran a survey to see what they thought of it, because we were designing the next cafe, the real cafe that was going to stay permanent for 5 years or so. And the feedback on that cafe, that it could be manipulated, changed around, Nothing looked too expensive. We actually, a lot of, the sustainability strategy that went into it, and we found that sustainability was coming up quite a lot. The younger generation were very well educated in sustainability and would often question us on a lot of the design aspects and talk about sustainability.
It's interesting the way the discussion's going. It's almost like the business strategy isn't that important. It's actually the human aspects, the understanding of how to use or how people want to use buildings over a long time. But Richard, one of the things I've noticed is the base building is putting more and more amenity in it for the tenants. Is that something you've noticed?
Oh, certainly, yes. The infrastructure that goes into what we might call base buildings is now much greater, and has to be, because often these spaces are occupied at increased density. The way we travel and move around has changed. We know a lot more bike commuting and walking. So all of those facilities need to be provided in a new building or adapted where we deal with an old building. I mean, it's interesting, this discussion we have about these things, because it's change is like a Hegelian pendulum, right? It swings in one direction and then it swings back, and that it swings out so that we've got everybody wants this sense of wellness and engagement and activity. So we're all running at lunchtime, doing a bit of yoga, and playing a bit of table tennis.
Well, I can remember the last crisis, the Goldman Sachs were doing wellness centres all around the world. They were the first thing to get ripped out when the market turned south.
Well, but what can happen then is you can get a lot of people who think, oh, geez, I just want to go to work, I hate yoga, and actually
and
I
why is
quite
everyone
like
bringing
being
their
a bit
dogs?
overweight,
Can't they keep them at home?
Do you know what I mean? Like, why can't I be overweight? What's wrong? I feel like, it's just...
We're not allowed to smoke.
I feel uncomfortable about this, and I hate table tennis, and I just want to do something, and I don't want to talk to some people because I want to write this report. I want to write a bit of poetry in the corner. It's like, and so as the pendulum swings back, we realise that, people have got to be treated ultimately with respect, right? And they have choice, and they shouldn't feel, bullying is not just pushing people around. Institutions, can bully. Organisations can bully just through their soft hand of expectation.
Buildings can bully.
You've got to eat healthy food, right? You've got to do exercise, and you weren't carrying your back, and you haven't got your steps up, right? All good, socially good for everybody, but it's not the whole story, because there's a psychological and mental side to this, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is the bit that we're touching on now, is that what actually makes the most productive employees is not their physical well-being, but actually their mental well-being, and working in an environment which gives them choice and control, but doesn't intimidate them. And that's why, I think it's hard to know where are you on this swing. Are you swinging back? Have we got further to go? Or?
Which is fascinating, because you're painting a picture of that. Designers are more relevant than ever with all the change going on. Their firm grasp of what humans need, and indeed, at Macquarie, one of the growing areas which surprised me was this idea of design thinking. That rather than us designers thinking we're not up to it, and we're, the smart bankers are the clever ones, they've actually started to use our methodologies as a way of being more creative and being more strategic about doing things.
Yeah, and that gets back to what I said before, talking to people, and we even engaged empathy interviews with people to find out what they really wanted, which was really important. And it builds, the brief becomes quite deep then. You have quite a true understanding of the culture of the company. It's not just the culture set above, it's the true culture within.
Very good. I might throw it to the audience if we're about 40 minutes through. So we've got a bit of time left. Is there anyone that has any burning questions they'd like to ask these people? We have a microphone, so if you just put up your hand, that would be useful. It's really dark. We can't see you, so you don't be...
There's a question about design. When you're confronted increasingly in an environment where people want to quantify everything and collect data, and you're selling a design vision, how do you negotiate between the statistical, which people might be very happy to take up the food chain in their organisation to get approval for something because it's going to deliver 20% more efficiency, versus the harder to define cultural and those aspects of and aesthetics, and getting people to come on board with something that they might feel challenged and slightly uncomfortable, sort of saying, I'll pin my reputation professionally on what this architect's telling me, and I think this could be great. I think there's not much appetite for that in a lot of these organisations now, and they're much happier to just go, it's more efficient, therefore it's great, let's do it. So how do you negotiate that, Richard?
That's a really excellent question that I think goes to the very heart of what we try to achieve as designers. And I think there's a real dead hand in all of the data, right? In all of the metrics and so on. And in a sense that can get reflected in organisations. There's heavy in the middle, no one takes a risk, everyone just wants a backup for it. In fact, there is no decision-making process, right? And of course, that's why potentially that whole middle section is going to evaporate. But at the moment, it's very, very strong. And I think the answer is fundamentally human, right? Because if you think yourself about the decisions that you make in life, right, you do not make any really important decision based on the data. We just don't as human beings. You don't decide to marry someone based on a pros and cons analysis, right? Because if you use that, you'd never ever marry anyone, right? Doesn't make any sense. You'll never get that argument to work, right? It's far too risky. We go with our heart, right? We go with something that actually goes right over all of that data. When you choose where you're going to live, if you're going to buy an apartment, you're nervously at the auction, you're paying way too much money for it, but you want to be there. You don't care that you're overcapitalising, or maybe you're indifferent to that. Ultimately, what pushes you into that decision is it feels right. Okay, all that data disappears, and human beings make decisions that way. Big ones like that, even small ones, because you never have enough data. It doesn't matter. This metadata, and you slice and dice it. You'll try and find an ethical way to do that. You will actually be paralysed by it ultimately. And so human beings don't work that way. Where they resort to that is where they actually stop behaving properly like human beings, and they just automate, right? And they just don't want to take a risk, and you've got to tell me it's 24% and I'll do it. So that's what you need to connect with. That's what you need to connect with. So you have to paint a vision for something that goes beyond all of that. And that very often means you're going to spend more money, right? Or actually means, we're not going to do that. Because if you're actually going to spend more money, you've got to spend less money on something else. So what is it? It's got to capture something. And interesting enough, money follows that too. Money follows that too. It's the special immeasurable quality that actually is invaluable. So how do you do that? You have to get beyond all of that and connect with the individuals, be they the leaders of an organisation, the officials in any kind of administration, or honestly the contractor on site who's trying to build it. Because the only way you get a good outcome is everyone's got to kind of lift their game, right? Want to do it. Everyone can tell you, it's like every day I hear these, you can't build it, there's a problem, we can't do that, we can't do that detail, we can't afford that, we can't do that. It's like, as our lives as designers are filled with, no, we can't do that, it's impossible. Actually, it's impossible to do it, can't afford it, haven't got time. Everybody says that. You have to make people believe they want to do this, because actually, you know what, that's all bullshit. You can do it, you just got to want to do it. So it's I think, a kind of form of communication where we've got to go beyond all of this stuff and say, this is a really special site. I don't know whether you've realised, but it's amazing here, right? We could do something incredible, or we could just do that thing, What do you want to do? Here it is. Captures people's hearts and emotions. I see it, in the most the number crunching investment people get it. They go, yeah, I can see it, right? I can see it. Or someone just thinks, yep, we're going to do that, and they put their career on the line, you know, and they get it. And interestingly enough, at the end of the process, I have never had the experience of anyone saying, well, I wish we didn't do that. Quite the reverse. You know, there was an image there of CPA's headquarters at Commonwealth Bank, you know, huge atrium in the middle. Took a long time to get that. And I remember the guy managing the site, very talented guy, very difficult to deal with, very, very difficult to deal with, until the scaffolding came down in the atrium. And he thought, awesome. And he's like, this is amazing. And yeah, everything disappeared. And so people see it late or early. You've got to have the right people to see it early. But so I think in a way we've got to cut through all of this stuff and get to really the heart of it.
Thank you. I just want to build on that. I think what people ask me all the time that I'm sure you get the same thing. Lots of people come to Australia looking at our workplaces and why are we ahead of other markets? Why are we innovating here? And you know, why is Macquarie an Australian company constantly in top 10 workplaces around the world? Why is it in Australia? There's something about the size of our market, I think, that, and we're a competitive lot. So someone does something and you can walk around it and someone sees the orange stair at 50 Martin Place, they go, right, well, we want a bigger one, and they see your building, and we'll do it. There's something about that, I think, that goes well beyond, here's the numbers, here's the cost per square metre, here's the rationale. There's something about being able to walk through it, and you know, our cities are pretty dense, the CBDs. You can go and see 6 fit-outs in a day easily to raise all that. It's much harder in other places.
Yeah, the flip side of that, I should probably say, is that if you do say, look, this is going to be awesome, and it's not awesome.
Oops.
And, you know,
Building trust.
yeah, that's right. If you don't deliver,
Yeah.
clearly, you know, you're in deep trouble.
You just keep peddling, don't you?
James, you were a big influencer in Macquarie changing the way that they looked at workplace. So maybe you could talk about, you know, how you went about.
No, I'm running this panel.
Oh,
I'm not allowed to do that.
No, but that was, I mean, you had quite a big impact on Macquarie at the time.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know you stood up and spoke in front of some of the most influential people in Macquarie and convinced them.
Well, it goes to that point. I don't think in any project we've ever convinced a CFO that's looking at the numbers to do anything. It's just an exercise in futility. It's always been the visionary that's said, don't worry, I'll get them to agree to it, kind of thing. And for a lot of organisations, someone grabbed me at one of these events a few years back and said, oh, you're so lucky you get to work on all these interesting projects. And I couldn't work out why it made me really angry. And there's nothing about luck. It's like at Macquarie, I'll tell you how we started. They rang me up and said, we can't fit 6 more people on this floor. Can you come and do it? And I said, no, you're mad. You know, you should have 20 less, and you should have a cafe, and we could put a stair in. And they said, well, you go and tell the business person who's running that, because we're not going to tell him that. So I did, and I came back. Blown me over, he signed up, said, yeah, let's do that. That's a heaps better idea. And everything we did, we then just pushed it a little bit. We brought a George Gregan's into the middle of the building, and it took years. It wasn't we'll do a big pitch, let's do this. It took probably 5 or 7 years of just little bits before we got a big Shelley Street type opportunity.
Yeah. So piloting and then case study sort of things.
But taking him on this sort of trust journey and all of that, it's really important. How are we doing? 10 minutes. I'm really interested in this thing you've thrown up around data. Like, if we go back to, you know, the Eames products that Herman Miller's had such a long association with, I don't think they had a lot of data, did they?
Well,
or did they research the human form a lot?
Did, yeah. And I think that's what I was talking about before in terms of you need to start with whether it's, maybe data's not the answer, but there does need to be some element and foundation of research. So whether it was the Eames chairs, it was the human form, of course, at that time. And then since then, when you're looking at those action office photos, that's based on some research that was done in the 60s at the time. How are people working? And what's actually incredible about that research, that book that was published, and it's still available now, is that there's elements in there that, and it ties into everything we're talking about, that were irrelevant today. The book could have been written last month. It's talking about things about people's health and vitality in the workplace. You know, this is the mid-60s and they're talking about media overload, you know, how to deal with the influx of too much information. Also dealing with the issues of privacy versus collaboration in the workplace.
Oh
So,
God, not that.
yeah, exactly. You know, we're having those conversations daily with clients. So it comes back, I think, really that humans, we keep talking about that, are really they haven't, yes, work has changed and will continue to change and at varying paces and back and forth, but really we're all human at the centre of it. So really looking after that element and supporting what's important, I don't think that will ever change.
Yep.
I think it's, and you know, I wouldn't want to suggest that I'm against that either, because I think a deeper understanding and the research and the data that goes into that is invaluable. And that's just like being on the edge of the technology of our field. It's our duty to be there.
Yeah.
I have to understand a whole lot of things about how building envelopes can perform. You've got to understand about how we deal with light and glare. You know, people worry about heat load way too much. It's glare that's a real issue, and what's the natural load. So all of the science of that and the technology that goes into materials and systems, chairs, you know, like, for example, we realise the most important thing is to move around and not sit still.
Yep.
So you know what? You don't want a comfortable chair. It's totally counterintuitive. Don't give me a comfortable chair. I want a chair.
So that's why architects
really
don't like
uncomfortable.
comfortable chairs. Or
These are really good. So you know, that's really important, I think, and we want that deeper understanding. And I think applying that more socially and mentally and understanding how do we stay, you know, because we all know how hard it is, right? So I think that level of data is really good. I just mean that the metadata that has become available instantaneously through all of our technological developments over the last 10 years and how we collect it.
I agree. I mean, knowing length of shower is not important, but understanding the value of, you know, purpose as being a higher order need. You know, we talk a lot about millennials needing particular things in their workplace, but ultimately purpose is something that crosses any generation, any gender, any organisation. Everyone needs purpose at work. So if you have purpose, that correlates to better productivity in the long run anyway. So the organisation gains from that too.
But you know, I agree with that. But it's interesting, isn't it? That simple bit of data about I've just picked something out of a wad of data, but you hook into it, you think, oh yeah, does it align with my preconception, right?
Yeah.
Women use more water in the shower than a shower for longer. Might be a preconception, right? You know, actually it's men. You already knew, really. But you gain that data, and then all it does is reinforce a kind of irrelevant preconception, which is actually the wrong way to frame human beings. We should never even be thinking about them this way, let alone designing for it.
Yeah.
So, you know, we will become instruments of actually the wrong values. Like, you know, I think, well, why have we got male and female in the first place? Because if you didn't, you wouldn't be able to even measure that data. So it's a very, you know, it's really interesting. I mean, you wouldn't ever measure, for example, hot water consumption by race, would you?
Yeah.
But you could. I mean, you almost. The trouble is, you will, right?
Yeah.
Because of the way we get. Well, just because we've got this metadata, we're just collecting ridiculous data because you can't help it because it's got all of your metrics in there anyway. It knows how much hot water you use. Or so I think there's a real question there, and as designers, you know, it's difficult territory for us because we're instruments of it as well.
Yeah.
In terms of what's going on with the Royal Commission into banking at the moment and the culture of those organisations, how much influence does architecture and the fit-outs embody that sort of behaviour, or enable that sort of behaviour, and is there any chance to reset the cultures, or is it quite separate, or, you know, what would be the relationship there?
So I've worked with most of the big retail banks. You're quite removed from that sort of, I think as the Commissioner said the other day, you know, have a dark room with a bunch of money and no processes. It feels like that. Yeah, but some interesting things like the London fit out for Macquarie with the big red stair, you know, which is quite extraordinary given the price of real estate in London. That was a big decision to cut that hole in. I think it was something like £3,000 per year per person in that space just for the hole. And yet the CEO of that business said 10 to 20% more productivity, people connecting better. But interestingly, a guy called Sir Stuart Lipton, who's, you know, one of my heroes as a developer, developed Broadgate, etc. He said if every bank had this, we wouldn't have had the GFC, because they would have been able to check what each other of the groups were up to a bit better. So I don't think we're ever going to stop, you know, some dodgy planner ripping off a grandmother, but we can certainly do a lot to create a more egalitarian, open environment. But I think the bigger question is actually how much longer these banks are actually going to exist, and all our fit-outs will be empty because, you know, the way that end of the world is changing so quickly. Like, I can tell you most of them are absolutely paranoid of an Apple or a Google or something that's starting to offer financial services. They'll be finished very quickly unless the government protects them. Sorry, there's a...
Question on that. What do you think the role government plays then in helping to kind of provide some mandates around workplace strategy? We kind of spoke a little bit about. I'm pretty noisy anyway. We spoke a little bit about workplace, like, and the influence of institutionalism on health and well-being and mental respect for one another, and the impact then that has on society. So I suppose, off your question, what role does designers have? But then I would argue, what role does government play in trying to create some parameters around that for all of us?
Well, government has the worst workplaces by a margin. I mean, I've done, you know, 75,000 square metres of, you know, Campbell Newman's tower and that was a very simple kind of, and yet it's daylight between those sort of new buildings. And I always thought about unions, that unions seem to be, they could have had so much power in the workplace, like the white collar workplace. You know, the same sort of power that, you know, they've done magnificent things on building sites, factories and all of that, but they're completely and utterly uninterested in the workplace. It's just not on anyone. And I always thought, God, you know, if the union said we want to spend $7,500 on the best furniture we could get, the employer would have to do it.
But there was recently a case of a government in Sydney, actually, a government department moving to an agile, you know, non-dedicated work point, and that did reach the commission level in terms of it was my right to have an individual desk and my own bin and my own pedestal.
Oh, really?
So it had to actually go in front of a commission to be viewed as, and the outcome was actually, well, no, it's not actually your right. It's not part of your employment conditions.
Yeah, so it's kind of the opposite, I guess, of what you're hoping that it might be pushing. It's actually pulling things back or something. I've certainly seen that with lawyers in the government where they've said, oh, we have to keep our offices, and they've actually gone to court and the judge has thrown it out and said, no, you'll have whatever space the government wants to provide you with.
So I think it comes back to values and vision, and there can be values in an organisation. And of course, as a society, we have values, and we rely on our governments to reflect them and just empower those values. And I think you can underestimate the power of statements and words. If an institution is prepared to say, we're about this, that equity is fundamental to us, and if we get that message as designers, then we'll go, oh, this doesn't seem very equitable. Your values are this.
Yeah.
Right. And if you get, obviously, regulation of the workplace by the state, in terms of appropriate policies that are anti-bullying, gender equity,
Yep.
ageism. These really important social issues that we face can come in the form of regulation, which is okay. The problem with that is like planning. This is like the lowest standard.
Yeah.
Right. So it's good, but it's like all regulation is designed to stop things going through the base, but the objectives can be put out there and can be used. They can be used when you're designing public institutional buildings, schools. What is our view about how we educate our children? I think how we reflect the values of the society of which we're a part and the degree to which we're empowered by them depends on the statements that are made, not just by our elected officials and so on, but more generally by the leaders in our community, whether they're public or private. And I think they are empowering bits for designers because, we don't have to, what I can say is, well, actually, do you realise this is what your organisation represents? This is its aspirations. So we're not really meeting them. You can pitch it up, I suppose, as a designer is what I'm saying.
I've realised I've been thinking about this, and thank you for the question, the wrong way, that, why are government workplaces so bad? I think it's the other way. We're the designers. We should be raising, the same way we've educated our corporate clients that this is much better value and it's your values living. But I don't think we've actually done that to the public sector. I think we've just let them go through their processes, and we haven't actually, held that mirror up to them and said, hang on a minute, you're meant to be doing this, this, and this. Why is your workplace doing that?
It is interesting, though, isn't it? Though, because some of that ironically, a lot of innovation does take place in the public sector. Like we were just talking about education.
Yeah.
Education is generally much more innovative in the public sector. Not necessarily so much in New South Wales, but if you look at UK and European models,
Yeah.
and then if you think about the whole workplace revolution, well, a lot of the models for that were the campus, right?
Yeah.
Were the university campus, were the way in which knowledge and research was promoted and engendered through a whole structure. So it's, it's done well and it's done badly. There's no, public-private divide on this, I think.